Good evening.
Hello.
Hello. Hope you can see and hear us okay. Please let us know if you cannot. But welcome. Thank you so much for lending your evening to us, or at least a small portion of this gorgeous night, for an overview of some exciting, although extremely disappointing analysis that Sarah Wolf, here with me of the Energy Action Network, will walk us through. Again, I'm Johanna Miller. I'm the Energy and Climate Program Director at the Vermont Natural Resources Council. Here again with Sarah Wolf, looking forward to spending about an hour with you on this gorgeous night. We had a really strong response. We're glad to have so many of you here on with us this evening. So this webinar is really focused on walking through the progress in terms of where Vermont is in terms of meeting its necessarily ambitious climate and clean energy goals. So the title of our presentation is Vermont meeting its energy and climate goals? And sadly, what you are going to see, and Sarah will go into in significant detail, is no, we are not. And we're going to talk about where the opportunity lies to do something different about that. So Sarah and I will be your presenters for the evening. I hope several of you are outside on this gorgeous night. We are here live at the VNRC offices in downtown Montpelier. I'm glad to be joined by so many of you. I hope that you saw the instructions related to, if you have questions specifically for us, please type the question into the box below. It will be sent to our moderator and we'll do our best to address it during the presentation. But we do capture all of those questions and comments, which are also important to us. So if we don't get to your question or get to your comment, ideally we can follow up with you. We will send you this webinar presentation later, and we can follow up with you in terms of any questions that we might not have answered tonight. And we certainly welcome your input in terms of how we can be addressing these important issues, because it's going to take all hands on deck. So the long and the short of it is, as you are likely well aware, that Vermont has extremely ambitious, necessarily so, energy and climate goals. We have a 90% total energy renewable goal, of being 90% renewable by the year 2050 across all energy sectors, so heating, transportation, and electricity. We have statutory greenhouse gas emission goals. And as you also are likely aware, the state did step in and step up when the Trump administration withdrew the United States from the International Paris Climate Agreement and said, we are still in, we are committed to doing our part in terms of meeting the Paris Climate Accord. And so that's another goal that we are aiming for. The slide that you see before you essentially highlights how we are falling dramatically short of those goals. You'll see the business as usual at the top of the chart, and then the very top line shows the Paris Accord goal, which is less ambitious, certainly out of the gate, than our own statutory and comprehensive energy plan goals. So as you will see, and we're going to talk a little bit more about in more detail, we are not anywhere near meeting those goals, and we have a lot more work to do. And would also say, whether or not you saw this news or not, we definitely wanted to put it on your radar because it is essentially our charge for being more aggressive, more strategic, and more swift in our response in terms of meeting those goals. Last week, the Agency of Natural Resources quietly released, I don't think it was a very broad public release, its latest greenhouse gas emissions inventory report. This is a report that has not been updated since the year 2013. So these are new numbers to give us a baseline as a state in terms of how much progress we are making related to our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and our state clean energy and climate commitments. The news from that report was startling and really disappointing. The long and the short of it is that the analysis showed that over the course of from 2013 to 2014, in the year 2014, our greenhouse gas emissions rose to 10% above our statutory 1990 level target. So essentially, our greenhouse gas emissions rose 4%. They changed the way they measured it, but the long and the short of it is with the new measurement, our greenhouse gas emissions went up by 4% to a 10% above 1990 levels. And then in 2015, they went up even more to 16% above 1990 levels. So over the course of 2 years, our greenhouse gas emissions rose 10%. And that's across the board, but as Sarah will go into in more detail, the really challenging sectors for us are heating and transportation. But our greenhouse gas emissions rose across the board in heating, transportation, and electricity. In the electric sector, we've done far more, but we did take our nuclear power plant offline, which in terms of emissions is cleaner than other alternatives. So that's one of the reasons that the electric sector emissions have gone up. So in this webinar, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah in one moment, and she's going to walk through their recently released in-depth analysis to give us a far better sense of where we stand, where we have made progress, where there's far more to do. And then I'm going to wrap up the evening with just giving you a sense of the possible areas of opportunity in terms of how you can help us, and help the state of Vermont make progress towards these very important commitments that we are failing to meet. So we're going to give you an overview of this great analysis that EAN has put together. We're going to wrap up the program, ideally getting you back out into the sun or back to your lives at about 7 or 7:15, certainly no later than 7:15. So again, we very much appreciate you lending your time this evening. Please do submit any questions that you have through the moderator, and we look forward to doing our best to answer them. So turning it over to Sarah Wolf.
Great, thank you so much, Joey. And again, I'll echo Joey's thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. This is a critically important issue, and I appreciate everyone's time and diligence and paying attention to it. Before I get into our annual report, I do just want to take a quick step back and describe a little bit about what Energy Action Network is, since I know many of you may not be or have varying levels of familiarity with it. But the network is based on a collective impact network model, which essentially means we serve a core backbone function to a lot of various organizations and businesses working on clean energy around the state. So we provide a few functions. One is a common agenda, establishing the goal and furthering the goal of 90% renewable by 2050 and ending Vermont's reliance on fossil fuels. We track our progress towards that goal by collecting data and measuring the results. And we publish that data through the annual report, which we are going through tonight, and as also through our community energy dashboard, which shows the data on a more local level. And then we convene the parties through various think tanks and summits and convenings to make sure that we're all on the same page and we have that important face time so we can go beyond the impact of our individual organizations. So our organization is just 3 staff, Jared Duval, our executive director, myself, I'm the network director, and Rob Fish, who's our outreach manager and our dashboard manager for that website. So please feel free to reach out with any specific questions to any of our staff as we go through this, but I just wanted to make sure everyone had that backbone knowledge. I will reference as I go through the specific pages in the actual annual report. If you have a printed copy, feel free to follow along. But the report is also available on our website, eanvt.org, and I'll provide a link at the end of the presentation and in what we send around so that you can check that out yourself after the webinar finishes. But to lay the groundwork, Joey did such a good job talking about what our goals are and where we need to actually go. But I want to take even another step back and just make it clear what we're talking about, which is total energy. For a long time, the energy conversation has been relatively focused on electricity. But when we're talking about climate, when we're talking about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we really need to talk about all the energy sectors. So that's transportation, it's thermal, and electric generation. You can see from this chart, those columns in green, those first two columns of transportation and thermal make up about 70% of the carbon emissions for our state. And in the latest numbers that ANR just released in terms of the carbon emissions, that number stays about the same. It shifts a little bit, but it's still around 70% from those two sectors, with transportation being the largest and thermal following. And together, energy generates 80% of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions. So when we're talking about climate, we're really talking about energy. There are other contributors, but energy is an incredibly crucial part of this conversation. And we're not as renewable as you might think. Vermont does have a reputation, which is well-deserved, of being on the front lines of renewable energy policy and fighting climate change. But just because we're on the front lines doesn't mean we've done it all. We have a long way to go. Our total energy portfolio right now is just 20% renewable. And those are largely driven, again, by thermal, which is around 20% right now, and transportation, which is around just 5%. The electric sector, we've done a lot more in. There has been more focus there. We're at depending on how you calculate it, between 43 and 60% renewable there. I'll get to exactly why that number is different depending on how you calculate it. But either way, we're not close to our goal of 90% renewable energy. We have a long way to go. But we've also made a lot of progress, and there's a lot of key pieces of technology that have helped get us to where we are today and are going to help get us to the next phase. So one of the things that we did in this report was we calculated, using known technologies, how could we get to the 2025 milestones of both the Paris Climate Accord and the 25 by 25, the 25% renewable energy by 2025 milestone that was set out in the Comprehensive Energy Plan as a milestone to 90 by 50. And we calculated this saying, what are the top 10 drivers that we could do that we know exist today and work today that we could ramp up to reach this 2025 milestone? That's shown in this graph below, and you'll notice that this is actually slightly amended from the graph that's in the printed version if you're looking at that. But this was based off of 2013 greenhouse gas emissions data, because that was the data that was available when we were drafting the report. Unfortunately, as Joey went over, the new data makes this path significantly more difficult. And we calculated that based on these new emissions, Vermont would now have to do 62% more than what's modeled here to meet our Paris commitment. And I'll emphasize that this is one path. This is not necessarily even our recommendation. This is what we modeled to say this could get us there. But the modeling now with the new revised numbers is significantly more difficult, significantly harder to do. A 62% increase in the amount of emissions that we would need to achieve to reach just the 2025 milestones is challenging. It's daunting. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time focusing on the progress we have made and the technologies we can use to start bending the curve in the right direction. So let's focus first on the transportation sector. And again, if I haven't noted this, the page numbers that you can find if you're following along in your annual report are at the bottom right corner of the screen. So if you're looking at your report, this is on page 14 and 15, where we dive really into the transportation sector. And the thing I'll call out here is, transportation is the least renewable energy sector. There has been the least progress in transitioning people, both getting them out of their cars and getting them into more fuel-efficient vehicles, whether it's public transit or electric vehicles or other forms of efficient transit. But we have options that are renewable, and the graphic on the right goes through the carbon emissions per passenger mile for the various transportation choices that we have available to us. You'll see that bikes are out of the circle entirely. They're always going to be the best way to go in terms of your carbon emissions, because you're not making any when you do that. But it's interesting to note that buses actually scored worse than planes on this. And the reason for that is that buses tend to be less full. They have fewer people on them than planes do. So the miles that are traveled are less efficient because they're moving less people from point A to point B. And so that speaks to not saying, oh, we should fly everywhere, but instead saying we need to include public transportation and getting people onto buses and onto trains as part of the transportation solution that's going to get us to where we need to go. And looking back at the drivers, those top 3 drivers include EVs, reducing vehicle miles traveled, and increasing van shares, ride shares, and public transit. So we really need to do it all to move in the right direction. With all of these pieces, the part that gives me hope is the economic opportunity. This is a graphic we included just to show in a simple way as possible the difference between the economics of a gas-powered car and an electric vehicle. On the left are the things you're going to pay for with your gas-powered car. You're going to pay $2.60 a gallon. That's now up to $2.93, depending on where you are. You're going to pay a lot of regular maintenance costs. If you think about everything you've had done to your fossil fuel-powered car in the last 2 years, think about the number of things that wouldn't exist in an EV if you had that. There's going to be a significantly reduced maintenance costs. And it goes down the list. For the electric vehicle side, those maintenance costs are lower. You're filling up at home. You're cleaning up the air, and you're setting an example for your families. There's a lot of opportunity there. And in particular, there's just more money in Vermonters' pockets to be able to spend on the other things that matter. Moving on to the thermal sector is about 20% renewable, and on the right-hand side, you can see what that renewable portion is made up of. So it's really mostly cordwood. Vermont is one of the leading states in the country for heating with cordwood, so that's mostly in wood stoves, and a small percentage in advanced wood heating with bag pellets and other. Advanced wood heating with larger furnaces and boilers, and then pellet stoves at around 5%. Then there's a very small percentage that is starting to pick up on electricity, on cold climate heat pumps, and switching off of fossil fuels for an electric option. So that's the thermal side, and this doesn't include yet. In this graphic, we talk about efficiency overall in terms of how much we're using, in the thermal sector and the electric sector. But focusing in for a minute on weatherization, one of the things that's come out of our work on this report and conversations we've had is talking about how do we actually bend the curve for each of those top 10 drivers? How do we actually get to where we need to go? And so this is a graphic. We haven't actually publicly, I guess we're publicly releasing it now, but we haven't publicly released it yet. But we're going to be doing more work on this in the coming months, and we'll be diving into it more fully in our 2018 report. It's saying, what are we doing so far on each of these drivers, and what is it going to take to bend the curve to where we need to go? So right now on weatherization, we are weatherizing about 2,000 homes per year, and that's been about flat. There's no growth rate there. It's flat annually. You can see at the bottom there's a table that shows the annual progress. Cumulatively, it's just going up at a linear rate as we add a few more each year. What we need to be doing is about 7,500 a year, or ramping up to 60,000 additional homes by 2025. And again, I'll caveat that that's based on the 2013 greenhouse gas emissions data. We have not been able to, since the data was just released, actually update this to reflect the new emissions targets and the additional work that we need to do. But this demonstrates that based on our current rate of adoption, based on the current funding that's going into weatherization, business as usual would not get us there. We'd fall far short of our goal. We need to do something that's going to kick the curve up, that's going to start the acceleration of that progress. But once again, there's an economic opportunity here. The economic opportunity with weatherization is obvious. You're just using less. You're keeping more money in your pocket instead of spending on fuels. But for switching on to renewable fuel, onto electricity or advanced wood heat, there's a real economic opportunity. The bolded lines at the bottom of this chart are the renewable sources, our cold climate heat pumps for electricity, and then your wood options. The other lines are the fossil fuel options. And if you recall, I'll take you back briefly to this chart, the vast majority of Vermonters, around 55% combined, are on heating oil and propane. And those are those top two, the purple and blue lines, that are both the most volatile and the most expensive. And so you've got middle and low income Vermonters primarily, particularly on propane, that are subject to the worst price hikes and the least predictability, whereas the renewable options stay level and relatively inexpensive compared to those fossil fuel options. And again, we're starting to see, we've seen periods of extremely high fuel prices, and we're starting to see those tick up again in recent months. So there's an economic opportunity there to keep Vermonters' money in their pockets and keep that money in the local economy. And finally, the electric sector. Again, we've done the most work on the electric sector, and I'll get to exactly what that's looked like in the past in just a minute. But that's led us to a pretty good place. We've got a renewable energy standard that requires 60% required in 2017, 60%. Sorry, 55% of our electricity to come from renewable sources. So we're coming in on 60% now statewide. The reason that EAN references that number as being around 43% rather than 55% is because we're calculating based on something called source energy, which accounts for the efficiency and transmission losses that occur when you're bringing that non-renewable energy into the state. So it essentially requires more fossil fuels that are actually being burned and being used in order to get that energy to the business in Vermont that's using it. And so it's a more accurate way of accounting the true energy that's being used, which unfortunately, again, goes to show just how much more we need to do to really get our energy, even on the electric side, to be completely renewable or to get to that 90% goal. I'll make a note, thanks Joey for the reminder, that we calculate source energy for electricity. We do not calculate source energy for thermal and for transportation at this time. We used to, but we've decided to be consistent with the way state government calculates it, and so we wanted to make sure that there were no discrepancies across the board, and this is the way that they have done it. So how have we gotten where we are on electricity? We've included here a brief history, and emphasis on the brief, of renewable electric policy in Vermont. That's on the left, and I know this is small, but I encourage you to look at the full chart in detail. But I included this next to this sort of report card on the right, which shows where we are and are not meeting our renewable energy commitments that we've made in the state, either through statute or through another form like the Comprehensive Energy Plan. The only thing that's green in that report card is the electric sector. And there's a strong correlation with the amount of renewable electric policy that's happened and the number of discussions that have happened on the left-hand side and why it's turned green on the right-hand side. Those same kinds of discussions just haven't yet happened on the thermal and the transportation side. And then there's also something to be said for the fact that we haven't had the same kind of solutions that cold climate heat pumps and electric vehicles and advanced wood heating are really making leaps and bounds over the last few years. So there's a lot more work to be done to understand how those technologies are going to interact in Vermont. But then there's a lot of emphasis around the need for policy and the need to have those discussions to make sure we can move these other sectors to green. And then I'll point your attention to the Pathways to 90 by 2050 analysis, which has been included in previous Energy Action Network reports. Again, similar to our drivers to the Paris targets and the 2025 milestones, this is one pathway. This is one way that we could reach our 90 by 2050 goals. But this takes the known technologies, everything that is currently contributing to our greenhouse gas emission reduction efforts and to our efforts to transition off of fossil fuels, and models it out to 2050 and says, okay, how many more of this would we have to do in this one scenario to reach 2050? So it's worth spending a little bit of time with this just to understand one analysis of the scale. And as with the 2025 analysis, if one of these things, one of these metrics, one of these categories changes and shifts down, then something else would have to take its place. So it's a balancing act between each of these things. If we decide not to do one of these things, then something else would have to come in and make up the gap there that's missing. So the final slide here that I'm going to go through is one last piece of hope that I take around economic opportunity. So the clean energy economy has been a job creator in Vermont. The most recent reported data shows those jobs continuing to increase, up 29% since 2013 when the state first started tracking that data. And the money that we spend on clean energy largely stays more in state. That economic analysis hasn't been completely calculated to understand how much actually stays in state when we spend $1 on renewable electricity, or when we spend $1 on pellets that are sourced locally in Vermont. But we do know that 78 cents of every dollar that's spent on fossil fuels leaves Vermont. We know that that money is leaving, and we know that some more of that is going to stay in state when we spend it on renewable energy sources. I will say that though we haven't seen the data the data hasn't been released for the jobs numbers in 2018. We do understand, based on Solar Foundation data on solar jobs and a couple other factors, that we are expected to see a decrease in energy jobs for the first time in clean energy jobs for the first time since 2013. That those numbers are going down. So there's huge opportunity here. There's huge potential here. But there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and a lot of action needs to be taken in order to bend the curve and to realize this economic opportunity for Vermont. So just a few things that I'll just make sure you know are here, but then we'll again be sending this out. As I said, this data is available at the local and regional level on the Vermont Energy Dashboard. So check that out if you haven't. Coming soon, this fall, there'll be town and regional comparisons via heat maps that are available on that site to more accurately see the aggregated data for your town as compared to your neighboring town, and see how you're doing on these various different categories in transportation and thermal and electric. So that should be really exciting, and we'll be sending out a lot more information once that's ready. And then finally, just a link with where the website, where the report can be found. I know that was also sent out in the chat box. You can see that and navigate there if you'd like. If you're interested in using this data, using these graphics for anything, if you want another webinar to talk to a different group, please reach out. We want this data to be used. We think it's really important. We know it's really important. So please do not hesitate to email me if you want to use a graphic or want to have a presentation to a specific group, and I'd love to work with you on that. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joey to talk about what else is happening around energy right now, and then how you can get involved.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you everyone for sticking with us again on this gorgeous evening. I think, what Sarah laid out, the framework that I set, what you all know is that we have a lot of work to do. It's both sobering in terms of the magnitude of the challenge in front of us, but as Sarah also noted, and I couldn't agree more, the opportunity is significant in terms of stopping our reliance on imported fossil fuels, becoming far more efficient, becoming far more energy independent, sourcing our energy needs through local renewable supplies, through regional renewable supplies, and keeping more of our energy dollars here in the state of Vermont. But it is not going to be easy. We have had these commitments in statute and our comprehensive energy plan goal on the books since 2011, and we have a lot more to do. So I'm going to talk briefly about what else is happening, a few of the sort of bigger arenas, and then also speak a little bit about how we can work with you, and we certainly want to hear from you about how we can work with you to tackle this big challenge. And then I do encourage you to submit any questions that you have. We can go back into the presentation if any of you have more specific questions for Sarah or I. We wanted to provide this overview tonight as a way to start getting this information out there to other Vermonters who care deeply about these issues, to ensure that we have a solid foundation of information upon which to be acting, upon which to be making decisions, and to ensure that we're pushing as hard as we need to make progress, because we are clearly tracking in the other direction. So as you saw in the slides that Sarah showed you, our challenges are primarily in the heating and transportation sector. You know, as Sarah also showed you in the report card, our success has largely been in the electric sector. That's certainly not by accident. We do have better technologies in the electric sector, although I think the solutions obviously in the heating and transportation sector have caught up. We have lots of options at our disposal that we can get into Vermonters' hands. But we also have a regulated electricity sector, so we have strong regulations, and we have supportive policies that have helped drive this catalyzation of a far more clean electricity sector in the state of Vermont. And I do really want to give props to, we have some forward-looking utilities here. We are really lucky to have visionary utilities here in the state of Vermont that are partners in this electrification transformation, and we have strong legislative leadership. But we have a lot more to do. So a few of the venues I wanted to just put on your radar, which you very well may be already aware. You know, 1 year ago from this Friday, the governor stood up and created the Climate Action Commission. That Climate Action Commission, of which there are 21 members, I am one, has been working for the last many months to put together a set of recommendations in terms of how the state is going to bend the curve on its rising greenhouse gas emissions. The commission will deliver its final report to the governor in the end of July. I would tell you we had our last full final meeting last week with the new greenhouse gas emissions inventory report news delivered to us just days before. So with this new framework of information, but little time to respond to it, we had that as sort of a part of our conversation. The long and the short of it is that the commission will deliver those recommendations to the governor on July 31st. It is a solid foundation with a deep focus on the heating and transportation sectors. How do we transform our buildings? How do we support the transformation of our transportation sector? The deep focus on both electrification of vehicles as well as transportation demand management strategies in particular. So it is a good report, a solid foundation upon which to build, but it is not sufficient. It wasn't sufficient before we had the latest greenhouse gas emission numbers, although again, very strong. But it is clearly insufficient now in terms of what we're going to need to really bend the curve, as Sarah was saying. And I would just also note that it makes a strong set of recommendations. It does leave several questions unanswered in terms of how we actually going to make those recommendations a reality. And so there's going to be a lot of hard work that's going to be required of the governor, of legislators, of entrepreneurs like several of you on this webinar, of concerned Vermonters who are calling on our policymakers to ensure that we actually have the framework upon which to actually innovate and grow jobs, put people to work, as well as to really transform our energy sector across the board. So we're going to focus on ensuring those recommendations are delivered to the governor and asking the governor to act aggressively and respond to those recommendations with sincerity and quickly. I'd also just say that one of the recommendations, the initial recommendations that the Climate Action Commission made, to the governor was to undertake an independent economic analysis of economy-wide policies that would actually help us, be the lever to bend the curve in our transportation and heating sectors in particular. Unfortunately, the governor rejected that recommendation of his own climate commission, but the legislature ran with it. They did fund an independent economic analysis of a broad look at economy-wide decarbonization policies. They tasked the Joint Fiscal Office, which is the legislature's independent, impartial fiscal arm, the number crunchers, as I like to say. Joint Fiscal has an RFP out in the field looking for a partner to do that work, an economist to crunch those numbers. They will be hiring some consultant in the coming days or weeks. That work will get underway over the course of this fall, and the final project delivered to the legislature by January 15th of 2019. I want to put that on your radar as an important thing to stay abreast of, as there very well may be some public engagement around it. I do believe that was part of the request that JFO made to any potential hire, so stay tuned in case that's something that might be of interest to you, but it should help provide that sort of independent, impartial foundation of information upon which we can look at things that, policies that will set the sort of regulatory or incentive-based or disincentive-based framework to drive down emissions in those sectors. So those include things like carbon pricing, including some of the specific carbon pricing bills that have been introduced in the legislature, many of which you may be aware of, as well as Cap and Invest, specifically the Western Climate Initiative, which is the successful program being implemented right now to the north of us in Quebec, which has been in place for many years and has some really impressive numbers in terms of what that policy has done for their economy, including helping them generate, by the year 2020, $3.3 billion in investment to drive back into solutions that the Quebecois can use to get off of fossil fuels. And just one fun fact I want to share with you related to that program. So from 1990 to 2015, Quebec's greenhouse gas emissions were reduced by 9%. And during the same period, their population grew by 18% and their GDP grew by 60%. So it's a lovely picture. Greenhouse gas emissions going down and GDP going up. It's the very sort of curve that we'd like to see with some well-structured policy implemented here in the state of Vermont. From my perspective, we're not going to make progress. We are certainly falling far short unless we have some sort of cap and some sort of policy that actually bends that curve. So what that looks like will, I hope, be informed by a strong, impartial economic analysis that will be underway this fall. And then how legislators, policymakers, the governor, and others respond to that analysis will be important. Clearly, that analysis and those kinds of policies are not the singular strategy. They're part of a broader picture, but I think it will be a really important foundation upon which to make an informed press for a policy that could serve us well here in the state of Vermont in terms of, really making that transition, keeping more of our energy dollars locally, et cetera. So as we look towards another legislative biennium, we can imagine that there will be several new policies introduced, whether carbon pricing or a cap and invest program or other policies as well, I hope will be introduced. And I know that from my perspective here at the Vermont Natural Resources Council, we're working with our colleagues and allies across the board to identify, where we might focus attention and really push for the strategic next steps that we think are required to make progress towards our rising greenhouse gas emissions. So a couple other things before we get to any questions you might have. In terms of how you can help, I think a few sort of short-term things. The governor will get his recommendations provided to him by his Climate Action Commission on the 31st of July. At some point after that, or whenever you have a moment. I think it's really important to thank the governor for stepping up and saying we are still in terms of Paris, to committing to our own state statutory greenhouse gas emission goals and the comprehensive energy plan goal, and then encourage him to act as swiftly and aggressively as possible to ensure that the policies, the programs, and the approaches are in place that actually will achieve those goals. The governor, to his credit, has been, very supportive of that. My hope is it's essential that it is not only rhetorical. It really needs to be in substance. He has a huge opportunity. I think we need to be backing him up. We need to be backing policymakers up who are willing to do that. So stay tuned, and please encourage the governor to act on the receipt of his own Climate Commission's recommendations. I also, I work, we are an independent nonprofit, but it is an election year, and these issues must be part of the electoral conversation. So this is not a partisan issue. It is important that these issues and these facts are part of the conversation. The Energy Action Network has provided us a solid foundation of facts. It's not a pretty picture, but it certainly can be in terms of the economic opportunity we have before us and the obligation in terms of the most pressing environmental challenge we face. So I think it's important to get legislators on the record, ask them where they stand on these issues, encourage them, let them know where you stand, and ensure that it is on their radar in terms of the electoral cycle. In just a few days, the Vermont Conservation Voters will be putting out its scorecard in terms of how candidates who have been in office have voted to date. That could be a potential good resource for you to track and hold your lawmakers accountable. VermontConservationVoters.com. And then a couple other things. I hope you have been following us during the legislative session on the climate dispatch that we've been undertaking. Each week we gave you an overview of what's happening or not in the legislature and what you can do about it. We're going to be doing another one this Friday, and we're going to be doing them over the course of the fall, and certainly again every week during the legislature. So please follow that dispatch. It's our way of trying to keep you more real-time abreast of what's happening or not, and how you can potentially weigh in at a critical moment. And then lastly, before we open it up, it's really important for us to know what you think makes sense. Like, what do you think is needed? How can we be helpful to you? Where do you think the focus should be in the state of Vermont? We are working hard as a coalition of groups and business leaders and faith leaders and academics and concerned citizens together, but we are not making progress. Far more needs to be done, and we need to change this trajectory. So it's going to take all hands on deck and good ideas on the table. Share your ideas through the moderator right now. We will capture those. They will inform our work plan and our efforts moving forward. So I would say that that's pretty much what I wanted to share with you, and just encourage you to stay tuned in. We'll be doing more of these webinars again, but if you have any further thoughts, we welcome them at any time. And if anyone has specific questions, Sarah or I can answer them. Were there any?
And there was one that came in, so I wanted to address that very quickly. It was related to the graph that I showed regarding the weatherization ramp rates, or how are we moving fast enough? And the question was related to whether we're going to continue doing this analysis and show it for the other drivers. And the answer is yes, very much. We are working on these for the other top 10 drivers that we identified in the thermal and transportation spaces. And we're going to be continuing to flesh out that analysis through the next year, and hopefully have more details published in our 2018 report as they relate to both the 2025 milestones and ideally also the 2050 ultimate goals. So the answer is yes to that question.
Does anyone else have any questions? If not, I would also say that we are happy to do more webinars like this. We can go deeper into a specific issue if that's helpful. We'll certainly be keeping you abreast. Oh,
there was another question that came in. We're just reviewing it right now.
Okay. If weatherization is important, how will we help Vermonters weatherize? How do we help rental property owners to change fuel sources? How do we help more Vermonters weatherize? Well, and I think it's a really important question in terms of how we do it. I think it, oh, there I am. Oh boy. I think it really is, it's a need to sort of make an investment. Right now we have our community action agencies who are providing a tremendous service to low-income Vermonters in many ways on many issues, but when it comes to weatherization, they are also providing a service whereby low-income Vermonters can avail themselves of weatherization, make their leaky homes more comfortable, stop hemorrhaging heat, which is crucially important to their pocketbooks, as you are likely well aware. Our Vermonters with low incomes spend a much higher percentage of their income, their budgets, on energy across the board. So the benefit of weatherizing their homes is many. So in terms of how we help more people weatherize, it is really about making it easy for them to do so, so making the process as easy as possible. It's also important, I think, to make it financially feasible for them to do so. So whether it's direct funding, which is what is provided through our weatherization agencies, who have long waiting lists often to get Vermonters, homes weatherized through full funding, or whether it's through funding and financing, a package of we need to make these upfront investments possible for Vermonters. So I think it's a variety of different strategies in terms of how do we get make it available for renters. It's a much more challenging question in terms of that, what they call the split incentive. But I think there are creative ways to be thinking about how we incent landowners to make those investments as well. And I know there's a thing, the Clean Energy Finance Collaborative, which is happening at the state of Vermont right now, is looking at how do we put together the financing and funding packages to support clean energy investments more broadly. Their work will be wrapping up soon. I think there's a lot of good thinking in that we will look forward to sharing with you all when it becomes available. And it really addresses that sort of split incentive question in part as well. Any other questions? Let's see, EP Cole. How do help energy committees with info on financing options? See, people, is there questions? Okay, we're getting some really good comments, and I will follow up with a few of you who are asking very specific questions related to your own arenas in terms of is legislative action for more funding something to talk to legislators about, foundations? So in terms of what I was just saying about the investment that's going to be required, yes, yes, it is something that we should be talking to legislators about, to the governor about, to policymakers about. Funding and incentives are not the singular solution to changing this trajectory, but moving people off of fossil fuels, which are deep within our society, is really a challenge, especially because of the huge upfront investment that is required. So yes, we will need incentives, or frankly, we will need disincentives. My organization has been working for a long time to explore and push for a fair but strong price on carbon pollution. We're not doing that because we like to, see new taxes or penalize people. We actually believe that a well-structured policy, when you're talking about being 100% reliant on imported fossil fuels for the fuels that we do use, we're talking about energy security and energy independence and moving away from a volatilely priced, internationally driven market. We're talking about keeping more money in Vermonters' pockets. That is an investment vehicle. That is a mechanism to drive different outcomes. But the long and the short of it is we are going to need to make investments to make this transition happen. So that is a pivotal piece of the equation. It is not the singular piece but we will need to put our money where our mouths are, and I think ultimately be far more stable, be far more, we will live far more affordably, and we'll be putting more people to work in the clean energy job sector as we need to. I don't know if there are any other questions. And it is 6:53 on a gorgeous July evening. This is definitely not going to be our only sort of opportunity to communicate with you guys on these things. The Energy Action Network is going to continue to lay out this essential foundation of information to provide us its analysis and share with us its research. And we're looking forward to continue to partner with EAN and with all of you as we move forward.
And ditto, yeah, I look forward to hearing from you with additional questions that come up, or ways that you think that we should be getting this information out to the public more. It's important that we all, as Joey said, start with the same foundation of information so that we can then move forward on all these ideas and ways to bend the curve.
And we are just really grateful for you lending an hour with us this evening. More importantly, for everything that you do all the time and everything that you can do to help us really work together and push our policymakers, the governor, to do what we can to actually change this really sobering trajectory. So we've got lots of opportunity in it. We can turn lemons into lemonade.
Absolutely. Now everyone should go have a glass of lemonade.
Exactly. Enjoy the sun. Thank you so much.